Barbara, this project, The Days of Works of Barbara Harper. Let's start from just the very beginning. When were you born?
I was born in Lima, Ohio in 1952. I was the fourth child of my parents, and we lived in a very rural area in farm country in Ohio. And my mother was a homemaker, and my father had just completed his engineering studies at the University of Toledo post-World War II. And it was kind of an idyllic childhood, lots of time outside, roaming the wilderness, the farm animals, and grandparents who I saw every single day. And my grandmother was a nurse and a midwife, and she was a pillar in the community, very respected, and you couldn't walk down the street with her in our small village without someone coming up to her and thanking her for being at their birth. And so I understood the importance of community with birthing babies and raising children from a very young age. I knew how babies got out, but they didn't tell me how babies got in. So
Yeah. Was that the maternal grandmother or the paternal grandmother?
my maternal grandmother, my paternal grandparents, I never met them. They had both passed away when my father was quite young. He was around 8 years old when his father passed away. His mother passed away just a year before, and I think it was, as the story goes, it was some kind of illness for both of them, and my father became an orphan, and all three of those children, his two siblings, a brother and a sister, were divided up between different relatives. And so they still stayed very close. And I grew up knowing my father's brother and my father's sister in their families, and the aunts and uncles who took care of them. But there were no grandparents to speak of. But there was the home. We visited often the home of the grandparents, and I saw evidence of my grandmother. And it was just a few years ago, I received a collection of her books that were passed down in the family, and I opened up a book of poetry, and she had written notes of a lecture that she'd listened to, and seeing her handwriting and reading her notes, I felt very connected to her at that point. Her name was Anna, and that side of the family were all German immigrants, and my mother's side of the family were French immigrants and Scottish immigrants. So it was an interesting um, arrangement, genetically speaking and historically speaking as well. And I feel that I've had the strength and the fortitude of um, of about 100 generations behind me. And it fascinates me how that gets passed on through the DNA of conception and the 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 prenatal work that I still do today with clients. I just taught a class yesterday to 14 parents, um, 7 couples. And one of the first things I do is ask them to talk to their parents if they're still alive and ask what their pregnancies, when they were in the womb, what was their parents' life like? I'm not so concerned with the birth because a birth is a birth is a birth, and we can talk about that later. But I always ask, go back and ask your mother if she felt cared for during her pregnancy. Did your mother have support? Was she loved? Was she in a good relationship? And if not, what was the relationship like? So we pass these things down epigenetically, and that is what fascinates me in all of the studies that I've done and the books that I read. Um, and I have bookshelves like you do, Olga, filled
Yeah.
with fascinating authors, and a lot of my training has been through meeting those people who have been introduced to me as teachers. My very first teacher of prenatal science was Thomas Fernie, Dr. Thomas Fernie. And I went to a lecture that he gave in 1982 at the University of Santa Barbara, University of California, Santa Barbara. And during that lecture, I experienced a rebirthing, a total body mind transportation to my birth. And then I asked my mother about it because it was horrific. It was a horrific experience, and she verified everything that I gained and the insights that I gained out of that lecture. And what was Dr. Verney doing? He was giving us a visualization about being an acorn and growing out of the acorn, um, and becoming alive. And it literally threw me onto the floor, curled up in a fetal position, and I, in my mind, I was screaming, "No, stop, stop, stop. I'm not ready. I'm not ready." And it turns out that my mother visited her obstetrician um, approximately 2 weeks before my due date, or 3 weeks, actually. It was 3 weeks before my due date. And he said, "I'm going on vacation. We have this new drug. It's called Ergotrade, um, and it's a chemical, synthetic chemical that is like um, oxytocin. And if you meet me at my office, or she was in the office. If you meet me at the hospital, this was 2 o'clock in the afternoon. He said, "You'll have a baby in your arms by 6." And my mother said, "Why not? Let's do it." And
Mhm.
um, and the rest is history. But it so negatively affected her body and her brain that within 4 weeks of the administration of that drug. She had an iritis, an infection in her eyes that made her blind. And my grandmother took over my care. She was still breastfeeding me, but someone had to be with her all the time, and she couldn't continue that care. And so I've explored that, going back from that 1982 lecture, um, that that took me through that birth experience, and that was kind of the seed of, well, it was the blossoming. I already had the seed, and that was because I became a nurse as my profession. I went to nursing school and graduated in 1974, and I tried to work in obstetrics. I loved obstetrics, but it was too painful. It was so painful in the 70s what we were doing to women. And I made a promise to God that I would never hurt a baby. And and soon after that I was working in um I was working in the neurosurgical intensive care, and then I switched to cardiac intensive care. And gradually, I came back to babies and worked in outside of a hospital. I worked in a um, um, pediatric, so a perinatal. I worked in a pediatric clinic, and it was in that pediatric clinic in 1983 that I was introduced to water birth.
Mm. Barbara, before you move on and expand the talk about water birth, etc., I heard you say that you carry about 100 generations behind you. With my not excellent mathematics, this takes us to 2000 years if we take into account that one generation is 20 years.
Hmm.
So could you just focus on this epigenetically or whatever way uh, of wisdom or knowledge is within this baggage of yours and share it with us?
Yes, that's something that I encourage women to explore their genealogy, but even without knowing the history of your particular genealogy, there's something that I've been working on for many years, and that's called the Song of Names, the origins of humanity on this planet. And the Song of Names, I'm including in a chapter at the beginning of my next book, which will be published next year. It's a book about water birth, but I have to start with that 100 um, generations, um, because we all carry that. Every single human being has a lineage of birth, and growth and death. Birth is the beginning, and death is the destination. And there is um, a the production of chemicals and the life that is lived during that generational time that you mentioned, of let's say 60 to 80 years as a generation. And that for me personally, I was able to um, trace it back on my maternal grandfather's side of the family back to the early 900s. That's how far I got back. And the stories that emerged from just my thought, just the thought of people who were seafaring in 900 CE, um, and where they came from, and how could they set across oceans and and do things like that. And and so yes, we look at this generation and the previous generation, but the Song of Names is historically an Aboriginal in many different cultures. I found it in the Menehuna Hawaiians. I found it in the Maori of Australia and New Zealand. I found it in tribes of Tanzania and Central Africa, Uganda, and it's a story that is told while the woman is pregnant to her fetus and is sung by the Menehuna um, as she labors, so that it lasts 2 or 3 days. And when the child is born, they have the entire history of their lineage back to the first person, back to that culture's story of the beginning, whether it was riding the back of a turtle up from the depths of the ocean, um, receiving the star seeds from the universe, into the people who would protect and take care of the earth, whether it was the story of the north wind, the south wind, the east wind, and the west wind, and how the cataclysmic forces of the universe came together to give us life. And I have witnessed the singing of that story. The one of the first times that I attended a home birth, I heard this music in my head. I heard this music, and I was an apprentice of a woman named Marina Alzugaray, who was Cuban, and she was taking me to home births, and all of a sudden I started humming this music that I was hearing, and it kind of went like this. It was hey, 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 ha, ha, hey, 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 ha, ha. And I was humming that, and midwife Marina turned to me and she goes, "Why are you doing that?" And I said, I'm hearing it. She said, "How could you be hearing it? That's the ancient welcome song of the Chumash Indians." And I said, "But
Mm.
I'm hearing it. I'm hearing this angelic sound." And after that, I realized that it was outside of me. It was being perceived on this generational level that had been passed down from the beginning. And it's the Song of Names. And when the Song of Names, like, I am the daughter of Ruth and John, and Ruth is the daughter of um, Bertrand and Fiona, and John is the son of Anna and Edwin. And and so if we sing the Song of Names, it goes back through every single generation. And then when it's finished, the child is born and has the memory. In the generations of the song in Central Africa during the Tutsi and Hutu wars, where they were massacring each other, the parents would say to the children, "Leave, go, go to
mm,
the go to the UN um, places. We can't all go together. You must leave by night." And here, and they put um, something in the backpack for water and a crust of bread or whatever to eat. And not a few children left, but hundreds of thousands of children all found their ways to the refugee camps. And the only way that they discovered that they could find their tribal relatives was at night. The older children would sing to put the smaller children to sleep. They would sing the Song of Names. That tribe's unique song of names, which they had heard at birth and heard throughout every time a child was born, the song of names was sung. And they would sing that melody to the children so they would fall asleep. And you could hear it throughout the camp. And 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 that's how they found each other. Every single tribe had a unique song of names that carried
mm,
through the whole generation. And when they got to the refugee camp, the older children continued it as part of that generational wisdom, that generational knowledge that was in their DNA, and they would sing it forth. And before they got separated by being adopted in Minnesota or New Jersey or sent to the UK or someplace where these children would find homes, the directors of the camps requested recording devices so that it wouldn't be lost for the next
yeah.
generation. And they
Mm,
recorded the Song of Names. And I heard this on the radio in a national public radio presentation, and it was exactly like the Song of Names that was sung by the Menahunas that I'd heard in person. It was exactly like the Song of Names. So, yes, we have a DNA recorded history in our memories that has kept us going forward um, with birthing our babies, being pregnant and birthing our babies. And I'm so sad that we live in a culture today that has created so much separation
mm,
that we have forgotten how being connected to the source of creation is what defines our humanity. And this has been my definition all of my life. As a small child, I could hear voices. I could see images of spiritual entities. I could channel um, those things that would reconnect us with source. And one of my very first teachers of source energy was my dear friend Binnie Ann Dansby. And she introduced me in 1984 um, back to Thomas Verney that I had seen in 82 and said, well, there's a whole incredible organization that just had their first meeting. And she was a speaker at the first uh, pre and perinatal psychology conference in Toronto. And she and I are still best of friends and support each other in this work of reconnecting to source, through breath, through hypnosis, through consciousness. And so all the work I do, wherever I teach in the world, I introduce those concepts of the baby, the fetus, and this newborn is always the smartest person in the room, because there is no separation to source for this new being, and it's us who creates the separation and the forgetting of the song of names.
Thanks God, Barbara. From time to time, nature has it that there are reminders like you and your colleagues that you mentioned, and who knows how many reminders all over the globe taking care of that. Thank you for sharing that. And
It's
there
my great
is,
pleasure.
that is, sorry, can you repeat?
It's Yes, it's just my great pleasure to be able to do this recording with you, Olga.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I'm blessed, Barbara, to be the listener of your soul song. And I'll keep taking you back because I also heard about variety, the variety German and French and Scottish. So there is mixing and movement and bringing together. Would you like to share a little bit about all of these movements and how you can trace them in who you are today?
Well, the my maiden name was Protzmann, Protsman, and it was German, and I came to find that it was had different spellings throughout generations, and it was actually Prussian, because in the medieval world, there was hierarchy and peasantry and separation in that respect. But where did those people come from? And it's always fascinated me when the first time I read through the Clan of the Cave Bear, I identified with that evolution of um, the mixing of the Cro-Magnon with the more Neanderthal DNA. So, um, and I thought about it and wrote about it and said, I was probably in that clan somewhere along the line. Um, there was a very interesting um, revelation that came to me, that we all come from the same seed.
Mm.
And one of the books that was fascinating to me was by hang on one second, I'll think of it in just a moment. I actually have it in a notebook. I keep my notes of my thoughts and my journals, and I have it written down someplace in here. I'll remember it in just a moment. But the name of the book was the aquatic ape. And
Yes.
yes, and if you know
The
that story,
Elaine.
yeah,
It's a Elaine, a beautiful lady, right?
yes, absolutely. And she also wrote The Descent of Woman, that
Yes.
is that is on um, my bookshelf. And studying those two things, um, Elaine Morgan, Elaine Morgan is her name, and the possibility that we had an evolutionary 100,000 or 500,000 years, an evolutionary process of leaving the savannas and going to the, whether it was the Red Sea or the Indian Ocean or the Mesopotamian area, where we lost our fur. We our pelvis changed shape because we started, instead of being quadrupedal, we were bipedal, and our hair grew long so our children could hold on to the hair and breastfeed under the water. And that just kind of blew me away with that thought that there was one. It was when the earth was still Gaia, and there was no separation between land, and then the tectonic plates started drifting apart. And so humanity sprung from this ocean um, of excitement. Why do we still need um, omega-3 fatty acids that came from shellfish? And and why are our tears salty? And why do our fingers um, um, get ridges in them when they're in the water, so we could pick up shells, so we could catch things that floated, and our toes had better gripping on the slippery rocks? Michel Odent talks about all of that as well. And were we communicating with the dolphins? Did we have that intelligence? Did we understand that the vibration of the sounds, or what caused our brains to wire in the ways that they have, that we're really truly a vibrational instrument of God? And God, as definition, is the source of creation, the infinite, the all present and never present, the all being and not being. Um, and so that brought me to wonder if my ancestors were actually, um, in 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 many ways, traced back to that Middle Eastern um, cauldron of wisdom, that today, every single day, I study Kabbalah, because Kabbalah is considered the the wisdom of mystical Judaism, and it's also very similar to the wisdom of Sufi, and it's also very similar to the wisdom of Maori, and it's also very similar to the wisdom of indigenous people in Lakota. It's called Maka Oyute, which means the people, and the word Yisrael means the people. And so there that, once again, going back to, where did I come from? How did I get into this body at this time? And what is the purpose for being in a body in any time, in any generation, from the beginning that Elaine Morgan and Michel Odent write about, and I studied with Sri Swami Satchidananda for the years, for about 10 years that I lived in Santa Barbara, California. And I studied under the oak tree at the Ojai Foundation. I heard lectures by grandfather Semu, and I also attended lectures by many, many people that I respected and learned from over that period of time. I worked with Roshi Joan Halifax, and all of those people made me think also, why am I here? What is my purpose? And I've come to the conclusion, and it's an evolving conclusion always, that we're here for that very brief generation, that birth is the beginning, death is the destination, and those are two transformational spaces that we come into an embodiment of spirit, and then when the body is ready to disappear, the spirit continues. And there are so many places around this world that carries that same philosophy, if you will. And in that study of Kabbalah, in that study of yogic tradition, in that study of Sufi, in that study of indigenous peoples, Maka Oyute. I don't like to use the term Native American because America didn't exist. It was the indigenous people, and we call them in Canada the first people. And they had that same, like, make use of your time here, to respect where you are, to walk gently on this earth and bring peace. It's about creating peace, peace of self, peace around you, and peace on earth. And to do that, you have to look at your separation, because the only thing that keeps us from being at peace is the illusion of separation, the illusion that we are separate individuals, and the understanding that those separations were definitions that were given in many, many different forms, whether it was the serfdom and the upper class, whether it was the religion of Catholicism that said there's only one way, there's only this, you can't be anything else. And for me to discover that this year is 5,785 on the Jewish calendar was mind-blowing when I discovered it at 17, that the Jewish people had persisted with source energy, with coming into spiritual embodiment in a physical body, and keeping the practices that kept you connected to source. And so when I was 17, I announced to my parents that I wanted to study, and I didn't care where it was, but I wanted to study um, um, Judaism and learn to speak and read and write Hebrew. And that's what I did. I converted by the time I was 22, and have been studying the mysticism, but also the Old Testament. We call it the Tanakh, and I continue this day with using Judaism and a few other techniques, because, Olga, what I found, that people who seek connection kind of do the seekers seek to get reconnected. Birth separates us. Pregnancy sometimes separates us from source. If the mother isn't connected herself through generations of birth trauma and generations of life trauma, she has to be reminded that this fetus is connected to source and is the smartest person. And that's why I ask every single person that I work with, whether as a midwife or a hypnosis teacher or coach or doula, to put their hands on their belly and speak. It was a book that Dr. Fred Worth wrote. He was a speaker often at APA. And I can't remember the name of his book right now, but he called it a mini love break. Just put your hands on your pregnant belly. Mother and father can do that, and just say hello to the baby. Hi, you're wanted. You're cared about. I treasure you. I cherish you. Thank you for coming to be my teacher. Thank you for coming to bring those lessons that I need to learn to be able to love myself, to honor my connection. Because the teachers that come in through conception, and every single one has a gift unless they forget. And it's so easy to separate and forget. And every single one of our birth practices in the hospital separates us from the source of creation. And that's what I teach. That's what my book, Gentle Birth Choices, was about. It was about, on the underside, it was about reconnecting to the purpose of birth, reconnecting with the purpose of gestation, reconnecting with the purpose of our spiritual entity that we are. And last week I was teaching in a large hospital in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. And it's what I do when I'm teaching about water birth is try to marry high touch and high tech, and a recognition that this new human being, when it comes out, needs to go to the sanctuary of the mother's chest and never, never, never leave until that brain is wired for connection and honored for connection. And both the mother's brain and the baby's brain wire in that time period of the first 72 hours. And so many of my clients have never taken the baby off of their chest for 72 hours. We just strap it on, and yes, the father can have the baby and the mother can have the baby, but they they the mother's brain, according to the research from Niels Bergman, Dr. Niels Bergman in Cape Town, South Africa, he calls it nurture science. It's the science of how nurturing brings us back to being fully connected and human. And I know Niels and his wife Jill, and they're devout Christians, and they believe that being connected to God in this way, in their definition of God, is the same definition as mine, even though we studied two different ways to reach it. And that is the all-knowing presence, the presence of the source of creation. And so I know that was rather a circuitous route to go from from my history and to bring Elaine Morgan into that, and some of our greatest teachers like Joseph Chilton Pearce and
Yeah.
the crack in the cosmic egg. When I read that, I wrote to him and he wrote back and thanked me. And I'll always remember dancing with him at an APA conference in Boston and 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 thanking Source for the existence of so many teachers and so many people of wisdom, that each one had a contribution to those 100 people, 150 people that you want to interview. Each one of them has brought us into focused awareness of how and what our human existence is about.
Yeah.
And once again, it's about gratitude for waking up in the morning. In Judaism, the very first thing we do, our eyes open, and we say the Modiyani, which means gratitude to God for
Mm.
giving us breath, for giving us life, l'chaim, for choosing to be in a body at this time, because we have multiple dimensions, and there and human life is a synthesis of those dimensions. We bring wisdom from everywhere, everywhere throughout the universe into this embodiment. And it's our job. And um, it was the Dalai Lama who said that our job as humans is to be happy.
Mhm. Yeah. So the Aristotle, the highest virtue of all is eudaimonia, which is happiness in
Mhm.
Greek, meaning
Yeah.
pursuing the highest virtue of all, or investing all your energy in the pursuit of good.
Mhm.
So, yeah, let's go to the space time or close to your conception. Since you were born in 1954 or 52,
52. 52.
50, this is 1951, perhaps the time of conception, and
Mhm.
very few years after the end of the Second World War.
Mhm.
So, what was the atmosphere, the ambience of the environment in Ohio, where you were conceived, gestated, and then born? And what were the main values, virtues, but also challenges at that time?
Mhm. Very interesting, because yes, my conception was in 1951, and my parents had waited 3 years um, to conceive another baby, or 2.5 years. And my two previous siblings were born right after the war, because my parents married in 1944, right after high school. And my father enlisted in the army and was sent to Europe on a boat. He arrived after D-Day, but his platoon marched across France into Germany. He fought in the Battle of the Bulge, and and it changed um, his perceptions of the world greatly. Remember, he was an orphan
Mhm.
who was raised by um, uh, an um, an aunt and uncle that never had children, and there was also another maiden aunt there as well. And my mother was raised in a very devout Christian. Everybody was Christian. We were Methodist, and my mother had three babies in 6 years, and they took a just a slight break. It wasn't easy in that time. She had worked in a tank factory um, during the time that my father was away in the war, and she told us stories of conserving food, even though she was raised on a farm. Um, and she blessed me with the gift. My family blessed me with the gift of only eating what came out of the garden. And 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 her family went through the Depression and then World War II. So yes, that got placed on me. When I remembered my birth in that session with Dr. Verney at University of California, Santa Barbara, um, I also remembered further down, I started rebirthing um, with Benny Dansby. Um, there were people in my life in the rebirthing community, and I used that when I was finally in my 30s, and I remember them looking into my crib um, and saying, "Why is she here?" Uh, and my father, in particular, how are we going to feed another mouth? There
Mm.
was this attitude of poverty,
Mm.
and this the even with the siblings, like she's going to take away from us. She's going to burden us and be a burden. And so as as I've dealt with my story, I help people today write a new story. When I lead retreats and I work with medical people, nurses and doctors and midwives in particular, and help them through hypnosis to discover their stories, and then we rewrite their stories. I do birth regressions in groups. I've done them in India, Mexico, China, Spain, US. Um, and by doing those birth regressions, it often reveals to us. I call myself an intuitive revealer because I'm not a healer. I'm healing myself. And we never give up on that healing process. I'm 73 years old and I'm still working on changing the script, changing
Mm.
the script. And yes, my life is infinitely better than it was in my 20s or 30s when I was struggling with the original script was she's a burden. She'll
Mm.
never amount to anything. My father told me that every single day of my life, either subconsciously or consciously, every single day. Um, why are you a girl? Why didn't we have another boy? Girls are girls are only meant for one thing. And so I took that story and took it to heart. And many of the decisions that I made were decisions based on that erroneous story. And when I started revealing that story to myself, it was easier for me to find a path of wholeness, to find a path of connection. And I offered to do therapy with my father. Many years later, he was um, he was born in 1925, and so this is after I had all three of my children. So it was around 1989, and he came to live with me, and we went to therapy every single week. And he started discovering his story, his history, and we sat in therapy and cried together, and understood that it's the therapist. Her name was Annette Goodhart. Amazing name. And she did therapy on a sailboat in the ocean. So she was parked in a marina, and I had been doing therapy with her for about a year, and group therapy. It was a group that we called, um, oh my gosh, what was it called? It was a meeting, and I held the meetings in my home and invited Annette to come in. It was like a mindfulness group, and we did group therapy together, and then we did sessions with each other during the week, and it was so revealing and so enlivening. And so those sessions with my father in that time after the war, it was revealed to me that he was part of a platoon that liberated two concentration camps.
Mm.
I think they were both in southern Germany. Medanich, I think, was one. I'd have to look up the notes that I had, but it had injured him so much that he shut down part of it. He would say things like, if we said, "Daddy, what did you do in the war?" He would say, "Some things are better left unsaid, not talked about." And so I feel like I got the silent father who was troubled because during COVID, my siblings and I started meeting once a week, and um, we would meet on Zoom and just talk about our days and things like that. And believe me, growing up, and I have one more sibling that was born 13 years after me in 1965, and he every single one of us had a different set of parents, because parents evolve in their own psychology, and the more children they have, every single day is a different day as they evolve. And so my youngest brother, my parents were basically divorced around that time, and I got a different mother and a different father than my brother that's 3 years older, and my sister who's 5 years older, and my brother who's 7 years older. And so by doing that therapy, I'm the only one in my family who has seen that side of my father in his pain and angst and what he dealt with. And when I tried to tell these stories to my siblings, they're they would say, "Oh, you're just making that up. Oh, you have such an imagination, Barbara. you 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 talk about your ability to see spirits and talk to spirits." Like the night that my mother died, she was in a hospital in Dayton, Ohio, and I was in my house in a suburb of Portland, Oregon, attending a birth. A woman came to my house to have her baby. And I was with a midwife also who was there. And we were attending her. And I took a break and I wanted to check in on my mother, but I was so tired. And all of a sudden, my mother is standing in front of me in the
mm,
bedroom and said to me, "The baby needs you. This is what you have been called for." And I am in a place that is supremely beautiful. And then
mm,
she touched me on my head, and I fell instantly into sleep, and I felt at peace. When I woke up, I went to back to the birth room. I had slept for about 2 hours, and when that baby was born, we were singing. I always ask my clients to bring their favorite hymnals or whatever religion they are. And we were singing a song that's called How Great Thou Art. And when women sing during their labors, the babies come out faster. They do, because your pelvis vibrates. Your whole body vibrates with the melodies of song, like Hallelujah or Om Namah. I don't care what the words are, but it's the intention of opening your throat and letting that music vibrate through your whole body. And we were singing, "How great thou art, how great thou art." Oh, and then the pushes
mm,
come. And as that baby was born, I was the first to see that the baby was born with no arms. Its feet
mm,
were on backwards, and there was a
mm,
strawberry mark from the head through the abdomen and all the way down from the chest. And I immediately threw a blanket over the baby and put my stethoscope under the blanket and listened to the baby's heart. It was good. And the baby started breathing right away. It was born in the water, and the father was behind the mother. And it probably took a good 4 or 5 minutes for the mother to lift the blanket off of the baby. And as she looked down at the baby, she was not in shock. She looked up at her husband and she said, "Honey, look at this baby. God sent us an angel. She has wings." Because there were two little digits out of the right shoulder and a tiny, tiny humerus and 3 digits off of the left shoulder. She had wings. And yes, I had tears flowing. And as I looked just beyond the birthing pool, my mother was standing there with this beautiful glow and smile. And she said, "God has chosen you to protect the little ones."
mm,
And that mother and father did not want to go to the hospital. And I gave her breakfast, food to eat, and I called one of my friends who was a pediatric naturopath. She came to the house, did a full examination of the baby, and she and I sat down and we talked and we said, "The baby needs to be in the neonatal intensive care unit." And I talked to the parents and I said, "Let's bundle the baby. I'll drive you to the hospital. I'll take you in. I'll explain to the doctors what happened and did." And this was May 27th, 1998. And we walked into the NICU. I gave a report to the nurse who took all the information, my charting, and with she was actually a client of the other midwife, but I had opened my house to her because it was easier for this couple to come to the house. And the very last thing that I told the nurse taking the intake was the baby was born in water. And the nurse looked at me and without hesitation, she said, "Oh, thank God." Because with this many pediatric anomalies, this baby needed a gentle birth. And I walked out, and that's when my tears flowed. I got out of the door of the NICU. The parents were there, and the baby was there safely. I knew they would be cared for. And I put my back against the wall, and I slid down the wall. And I sat on the floor and just started sobbing because I had the realization that my mother had died during the night. And I picked up the phone and I called the hospital, which I had done every single day for the last 10 days that she was there post surgical. And I talked to the nurse and I said, "Did my mother die at the very specific time?" And she
Mm,
said, "No, she coded and we put her on a ventilator." And I said,
mm,
"I need to talk to my sister that my mother is not in her body. She's here with me in Oregon." She has visited me and she's told me that she's happy and she's perfect and she's wonderful. And so I did get a hold of my sister by phone in the hospital room. And and the first thing my sister says to me was, "Stop making things up and lying to me." I'm here at the hospital. I'm right beside her. I'm holding her hand. And I said, "If she's on a ventilator, you have to take her off because she's not there." And my sister held that against me for so many years that I would make up such a story. But I saw her in person. And fast forward a week later, I'm in Ohio attending my mother's funeral, and my sister and I go into the pastor's office before the ceremony, and he says, "Your mother left an entire diary of what she wants, and she wants the two of you to sing at her funeral, and she wants you to sing the song, 'How Great Thou Art.'"
same.
The same song that I was singing when she appeared to me.
Yeah.
And so,
Mm,
yes, my siblings had a different set of parents. And
yeah.
that's with every single family. And every single person in the family has a different perception of what those parents were and how they acted and responded to you. And so that's why I spend time helping people rewrite their stories. And
Mm,
it's never too late to write a story of goodness and mercy and hope and healing. Um, Day before yesterday, I fasted from 3 o'clock on Friday until 7 p.m. on Saturday as part of the Yom Kippur fast. We fast and we pray and we connect to God. And I wrote down a new story. Every single year, I write down a new story. and
mm,
and and to understand how connected we are and what you have to do to just simply take that deep breath and go into the space of connection. Yesterday in my class, teaching those 14 parents, I said, does anybody understand what the definition of holding space is? Partners, you're going to be holding space for this woman as she has just enough control to let go of all control, to let the baby do the work of being born, because it's through that work that the brain wires for connection. It's through that work that coming through the pelvis that the brain wires to set us up as a whole and complete human being. And that's not to say that you can't retroactively take a cesarean born baby and help rewire the brain. You can. But I ask, what's the definition of holding space? And they offered different definitions. And I said, let me tell you what it is. You walk in that room and you surrender yourself to letting go of all judgment. And you are in a space of emotional presence without judgment and without expectation. And that is the definition of source. There is no expectation. There is no judgment. I did have a near-death experience when I was 17. And I call it my council of elders. I had a heart attack from an accidental overdose of amphetamines. And yes, it wasn't intentional. I had a lot of term papers to get finished. And I thought, well, if I stay up all night and write and study, I can get this done before we break for Christmas break. We can finish the term. And I forgot how many amphetamines I had taken. And so I took more. And what did that do? It created um, a cardiac arrest. And yes, I was brought back and I was in the hospital and I was on a ventilator. And while I was in that short space of probably 2 to 3 minutes, I spent what felt like a year asking questions. And to my council of elders. And they all appeared to be bodiless, but they had robes on. And I asked the question, why does God judge us so much? And they said, there is no judgment from heaven. There is nothing that creates judgment. You're the one who judges. You're the one who punishes. You're the one who creates strife. You're the one who does this. It's a human reaction. It's a human trait. The source of all creation, as we said earlier, wants only good things for us. The universe will bless us with everything we desire if we remove our judgment of ourselves. If we take those stories away. And I said, but the Bible is full of this. And they said, that's not what was written. That's what was translated. And so when I woke up and was there seeing my parents crying, and it was like 1 o'clock in the morning, and I said, just leave me, please. And I asked the nurse to call my Methodist minister. I wanted to share with him what I had seen and heard in those moments of being between worlds. Because I could have stayed on the other side and been totally at peace. But I chose, and I was accompanied back. So every time somebody brings somebody back to life, and there's so many stories now of books written. There was one, my favorite books is Why Wait? Why wait to cross over to the other side? To
Mm,
realize that we can have heaven on earth. Why wait to tell people you love them and that
mm,
you respect them, and there is no judgment? I have it on my bookshelf, and I know the cousin of the author. So my Methodist minister came in at 1:30 in the morning, and we sat and talked until sunrise. Remember, I'm 17 years old, and he's my elder. And his conclusion was, I think God wants you to read the Bible in Hebrew. I said, okay, how do I do that? And he introduced me to my first rabbi, Rabbi Oster of Lima, Ohio. And he was a conservative rabbi. And I ordered records from New York and started learning Hebrew. and, it was an amazing time of discovery. I started getting books, and I actually worked at the library. And so all of the books that were contraband on yogis and Kabbalah and things like that, I devoured them. I read them. And in the summer that I turned 18, I spent a month at the Anne Frank house in Amsterdam, volunteering my services, and going to the Portuguese synagogue and meeting Jews from all over the world. And the first time I heard the Shema in a congregation, it was goosebumps throughout my whole body, and I felt connected to Source. And so, how could I not convert to Judaism and study it for the rest of my life as a means to find connection? And that's what I did. So once again, we've had a circuitous route of your question that brought this forward, was to talk about that time post World War II, and part of that discovery by volunteering at the Anne Frank house and becoming a tour guide and sitting in that room where Anne Frank wrote her diary, and looking out the same window and seeing the same tree. It was if I was there, and it informed my brain that we can time travel anytime we want. We can go to different places, and we have that capability to synthesize those dimensions. And if you talk to my friend who was in Puerto Ordaz, Venezuela, at a birth, Dr. Fernando Molina, and he called out to me in prayer. And I answered that prayer by time traveling and showing up at a birth in Puerto Ordaz, and telling him exactly what to do to attend this woman who was a surprise breech, and sitting with him and discussing it and holding his hand. And when I woke up the next morning, he called me and thanked me for being at the birth that night. And I said, I wasn't I? And then he tells the story to a whole group of people, thanking me for coming to guide him through this breech birth. And so, Olga, our capabilities as in this human body are so vast, and
Mm.
they never end. There is no death. There is no death.
Very nice. Good reminder, Barbara. You are a good reminder, a good storyteller, reconnecting or connecting or putting the thread together or keeping the thread untouched.
Mhm.
Is
Mm.
there any uh, connection between your mom? What is her name?
Ruth Eileen.
Ruth Eileen. Uh, your mom, your mom, and the best qualities you can see in her, but also the challenges she had as a human being, and the kind of person you became. She ideal.
She endowed me with curiosity. She endowed me with fortitude. It wasn't until years later that I discovered, um, after I was in the hospital with that accidental overdose, um, in January, February, there were tryouts for our high school musical. Every year we put on a high school musical. And that year, the high school musical was Oklahoma.
Mhm.
And I tried out and I would take any part, but I really had my heart set on the lead role of Lori in Oklahoma. And I was singing and playing the piano, and I knew all the music by heart. And I would go into the backyard and I would sing, "Oh, what a beautiful morning." I would sing it out, and she had purchased for me the no, she hadn't purchased for me. It was her music that she played as a child, when the musical had first come out, not as a child, but as a young adult. I think it was like 1948 or 49 the musical came out. And she had the sheet music. She loved to play the piano. And she went to the director of the play. He was our French professor, and he also was head of the theatrical group, the Thespians, and of which I was a member. And she called him up, went to his house, and said, "My daughter needs to be Laurie. She knows every piece of music." And he said, "I haven't picked her for the lead role. She has a beautiful voice, um, but she's a little bit bigger than the ingenue role. She has a presence of being older. I want her to be Laurie's mother in the play." And she said, "No, she needs to be Laurie because her confidence needs that." And he acquiesced, because then she told him about that accidental overdose, and she played it like I had tried to commit suicide, and he felt so sorry for me that he gave me the role, and it was a hit. We did 6 performances, and we took the thespian group to other high schools around the state, and it was forever kind of a monumental shaping of who I am. And I had dreams for years and years that I was in front of an audience, and the thespian director came and said, "Oh, we're not doing this play tonight. We're doing this play." And so it what it created in me was this flexibility to see every possibility, and that was what my mother blessed me with. My mother was a fighter. She would she would sit down and type letters to the president of Kellogg's, the president of um, the motor company. If she had a complaint, she would lodge it. She would write letters to the editor. She would write letters to the UN. She would write letters to the head of the Air Force. She was what we called back then a rabble rouser. And I still use that term to describe me. And and so as I came into my own, when I was in the hospital, I got released from a job because I complained about the doctors. I said, "They're abusing the patients. This is not how we should do birth."
Mm.
I would knock the scissors off the table on purpose. "Oh, I'm sorry, doctor. Let me go get another pair." And by the time I came back, the baby would be born without an episiotomy. When
Right.
when a
Mhm.
episiotomy was done on 100% of women, I said, "This is abuse." And so I wrote my first book, Gentle Birth Choices, out of those insights and interviewing people. And I said, if and my first water birth, I went to France to study with Frederick Laboyer because he was a pioneer in putting the baby back into the water. There was not one single article in a magazine or a scientific journal, but at the time that I decided to have a water birth, Michel Audin published in October of 1983, and I didn't even discover that until after I had a water birth. I went to France in 1984, and I hadn't seen the article yet. He wasn't there. But I did meet with Frederick Laboyer, and I just knew instinctively that it was right. And I always said water birth is easier for mothers and better for babies. And now today we have over 700 scientific articles, some of which I've written, but that prove that it's easier for mothers and it's better for babies. So my mother told me, trust your instincts. Always trust your instincts and do what's right. Always do what's right.
And since you have a strong voice, dowry from your mother's side, but also a silent father
Mhm.
because of whatever. Can we focus on the father? What is the name of your father?
John Madison.
Right. So can we focus on him and see what was the best quality that you can identify and which is, has been woven in who you became today?
Well, it's interesting that you asked that question because my siblings literally hate my father and
Mm,
and feel like he had some, and later in life he had some from that torture that he went through, um, grandiosity. But what he gave me was no dream is too big.
mm,
Um, as he got older, he introduced me, and I have his original book written by Norman Vincent Peale, on how to make friends and influence people. And he handed it to me, and he had a side of intolerance, and he was abusive, but as I stated earlier, that was a reflection of the abuse that he had suffered. And I had to accept both parts of him. There was a part of him that wanted a different world, and he was willing to dare and step out and assume a role of greatness. He he felt like my mother was focused on protection, which
mm,
was, it was kind of reverse roles where a father should be protector and provider. My mother was protector and provider. She provided the income, by working in the factory while he went to school, and
mm,
then she provided the income for the, and she canned all the vegetables and grew the garden, and then also worked at Goodyear Tire and Rubber Factory, and lost her life because of that, because of the chemicals that completely, um, took out her immune system and led to her early death at 74. And while he quit his job and started selling things door to door and holding seminars on how to change your life. He was an early, um, what do you call it, multi-level marketing person in the 70s, and and had some amazing schemes of of selling chinchillas and vitamins and all kinds of things, and even put on seminars, that were called Dare to Be Great. And so I learned from him that whatever dream you have, it's not too big, and don't give up on your dreams, because your dreams are given to you through your spirituality. And he was superintendent of the Sunday schools, and every single person that met him just beamed and smiled when they said hello to him. And and I inherited from him, like, yes, this never give up syndrome, but also the combination of my mother holding in her disappointments of life and not complaining about them, which was very typical of the 1950s and 60s. Okay, nobody complained about anything. You didn't air your laundry. you yes, you hung your laundry on the line, but if emotional issues, nobody talked about them. And so you learned how to be like a stalwart of holding your frustrations and your emotions inside. And
mm.
yeah.
Isn't it interesting, Barbara? Your mom was a fighter and wrote letters to complain about this and that, which was unjust.
Hmm.
But she was holding the disappointments of life, did not voice them, silence like the father. And then the father, silent as concerns out uh, speaking about whatever wounds or whatever, or but inside there was this greatness and boldness which he tried to reawaken through the seminaries he
Hmm.
offered. It's a very interesting duet that is at play.
It was always a very interesting duet, um, because our dinner table, he was a diehard Republican and she was a diehard Democrat, and and they joked about it. They joked about we would have political discussions. We would, it was required in our house to read the newspaper and to have discussions at the dinner table about our thoughts. And my brother, when he was in high school, was Young Republicans for Eisenhower, and whatever. And um, and it was encouraged to read as much as you could and to have opinions and discuss them. But emotional issues, never, 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 never. Those
Yes,
all had to be silenced.
right. What a pity what we lose, or we delay. As you said, why wait for your
Mhm.
greatness to be aired and shown? Now, Barbara, you mentioned that your birth was, let's say, pressed 2 weeks or some time
I
before. You
Mhm.
were not ready for that.
No. In
Now,
the Yeah, go ahead.
can you see how this perinatal experience of yours is connected with the pioneer work? Because in the kind of work you do, you have done, you have been doing, is that you waste no time. You go before times, or you push time boundaries. So how do you connect to that? If there is any connection?
Mhm. Well, it's as everything has a duality in life. And so the pushing me to leave the womb earlier than I was ready, gave me um, a back seat, so to speak. I feel like it made me an observer. Um, and I've seen that in my own children who have very successful lives, and I was not successful in having relationships with partners on my own. And I I chose two partners to have children with who were much older, the age of my parents or older. And that didn't work for me because it made me frustrated just like my mother.
Mm,
And on the same hand, I wanted to push the envelope, um, with my second partner, Harry Kislevitz. Um, he was the gregarious side of my father. My
mm,
first husband, um, Joseph Bronstein, was the serious side and the complaining side of my father, and the the judgmental side of my father. And I've worked all that out in therapy as well. And so that's why I invited my father to live with me and Harry Kislevitz and go to therapy. Um, because Annette Goodhart would say to me, well, as soon as you settle and come to terms with this relationship with your father, you won't need to marry older men anymore. And we joked about that because I was still looking for someone to take care of me
Mhm.
in that sense, financially and emotionally. And and the two men that I had children with were both financially capable of taking care of me, but emotionally it was horrible. It was absolutely horrible. They were both narcissistic and
Mhm.
and dedicated to blaming me for everything in their lives. And I can see now through that veil, pulling the veil back, and seeing how I played that out in my personal life, and professionally, it made me. I took my mother's side to be the rabble rouser and the letter writer and the opinionated person, and and expressing that. Yes, my second partner, Harry, really respected that I did that and supported me in the beginning. And we probably spent a good $500,000 on organizing and getting Waterbirth International out to the world as a nonprofit organization, because I founded it in 1987, and we went to Russia and I studied with Igor Tchaikovsky, and it was all funded by Harry Kislevitz, um, because it was we were together and we had two sons together who were both born in water, and he said, whatever you want to do, I'll support you. I'll support you 100%, whatever you want to do, but just don't ask me to support you emotionally. you
Mhm.
His behavior told us that. And that's how I started working with Benny Dansby, because she would come in and do rebirthings separately for both of us. And then I introduced rebirthing, I introduced Reiki, I introduced Feldenkrais. I had studied before I met Harry. I was on this healing journey from the first relationship, and that's why I was working in a clinic with in Santa Barbara clinic, and then with Richard Shamus and his wife Carol Lee, and we had a holistic medical practice. And oh my gosh, studying so much of that then contributed to my forward thinking about midwifery and perinatal consciousness and prenatal consciousness, and then meeting Marina Alzugaray and working with Ananda Zarin, who was a world-class homeopath. All of those people got introduced to me at that time, and I must say that my my fortuitousness of being drawn to those people and I started writing Gentle Birth Choices in 1987 after visiting Russia for the first time, and spending time with Igor Tchaikovsky. And it was and it was titled then Water Birth, Water Baby. And it was about the experience of having been in France and Russia, and spending time with Frederic Laboyer, and having my own two water births, and then working with, by 1987, I'd already helped about 15 women have water births. Um, However, I couldn't get published. I submitted it to dozens and dozens of publishers, and it was jokingly titled "What a Birth, What a Baby," or "Water Birds, Water Babies." And so I retooled it and hired someone to help me um, get the message out, and and it got better and better by talking about all birth. And the chapter on water birth was just a chapter, that this was one of the myriad choices that women have today, but throughout all of it was the consciousness. And there's a whole entire chapter about the consciousness of babies. The baby is the driver. I
Mm.
talk about it why do we get pregnant? Because of the nodal points of consciousness, and I truly believe that this spiritual entity brings these two people together for to be able to have a conception in which they can enter. And that conception can either be traumatic. When I first heard of conception trauma, I was like, oh my goodness, give me a break. Isn't birth trauma enough? But yes, there is conception trauma. And in Gentle Birth Choices, I wrote, if we could just refocus and stop talking about abortion, and put all of that energy into taking care of educating women and preventing conception under dire circumstances where a baby is not wanted, is not needed, is a burden emotionally, physically, spiritually, and financially. Abortion would disappear if we could fund the clinics that would support women, if we could fund the and change the childbirth practices that would separate babies from their mothers and create those emotional breeding grounds for disembodiment and disconnection, um, the world would be a different place. And so, yes, I took my conception trauma and my birth trauma and my childhood trauma, and and poured it into who I am. And because this is a question that I asked my last group when I was in Peru 2 weeks ago. I said, what if every single decision that you make is the right decision? No matter what that decision came from. Because going back to the universe will give you exactly what you ask for. And it's either, and so if you look at this, no matter what your history was, no matter where you came from, no matter what your genealogy, you make a decision. And then I remembered my grandmother. And by the way, I took my grandmother's maiden name. She was Estella Ethel Harper from Scotland, from the Harpers of the village Harper in Scotland. And I've gone back to look because I didn't like the Germanic. The term Protzmann means self-inflated importance, narcissism, basically. And my first husband was Bronstein. My second husband was Kislevich, which nobody could spell. And so I said, what do I want to be? I want to be a Harper. I want to have that role model because my grandmother always said, never make a decision unless you're forced to. Let God decide for you.
Mm. What a beautiful, how beautiful. Mm.
So, what if every decision that you make is the right one?
Mm.
Take it all. Take it all and live your life. When I first met Sri Swami Satchidananda, it was in an Episcopal church. It was a lecture. There were about 300 people there, and I waited in line to shake his hand. And I said to him, I have to laugh about it. There was no arrogance when I said this. I was just so happy to meet someone that shared my philosophy. And I shook his hand and I said, thank you for doing the same work that I've been called to do.
Mm.
And that was to bring peace.
Excellent. Barbara, when did you feel ready? When was it that you felt really ready to get out in the world, be born? I mean, not as a baby, but now as a professional, water birth, or before that, or after that. What was the moment? And how did you recognize that moment? If this moment is past, that you were, now it's the time to be born.
It was December 31st. So it was New Year's Eve. 1980. And it was a realization that in in Genesis, God speaks to Abraham and he says the words in Hebrew, Lech Lecha. And Abraham, and that translates to go forth,
Ah.
leave, go. And Abraham answers God by saying, Hineni, which translates, here I am.
Mm.
I am here, and I hear you. When we say the Shema, Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Hear every person, all the people. There is one source, and we call that source Adonai Eloheinu, the master of the universe. That's what it means. But the Shema is asking us to listen. Listen to that voice that's the master of the universe. And that night, I had this perception of, oh my gosh, I've been called. But I'd had that call many times. I'd,
Mm.
I'd, I'd heard that call many times, but I'd never listened to it.
Mm.
And that night, I listened to it. And on December, 1 year later, I'm driving to California in my Volvo station wagon with my baby in the back. And she was singing and she says, "Where are we going?" And I said, "God will tell us." And I drove to California, and on February 12th, I settled in Monterey, California, and took a job in a hospital as an cardiac intensive care nurse. And I barely made it through the training before I heard this voice say, "This isn't for you. There's other things for you. There's other things to do." It was it was like the night when I was a second year. Had finished my second year of college. I came home to visit my mother, and I sat down on my bed, and my grandmother, who had passed away the year before, sat down beside me, and she said, "You need to be a nurse because God needs you for the little ones."
Mm.
And I argued with her and said, "No, grandmother, I want to be an actress. I want to be, remember, I was the star of this, and I had gone in to study English so I could be like my thespian teacher, and I could help wayward young girls in high school express themselves." And my grandmother said, "No, no, God needs you for the little ones. Go read your Bible." And I had to hunt for my Bible. I had to look for it. It had my name printed on the outside. It had a zipper, and I opened it up, and it automatically opened up to Psalms. And I looked down the Psalm at the page, and it said on there, "Children are a gift of the Lord."
Mm.
And right there at that Psalm was this very ring that my grandmother had given to me when I was 16, and I had lost. It
Ah.
was it was lost. And she said that night, "You'll find everything that you've lost in your Bible." And there it was, this ring, this very ring that I keep. I never travel with it. I always leave it at home. But the first thing I do when I come home is I put it on. And I just finished 10 pages of scripture for a conference. And I said, and the title of my presentation was Remembering, Keeping the Faith, Remembering God's Presence in the Birth Room. And I distributed these 10 scriptures, and they're written in a form where you can pray into them. The first is praise. Praise God. The second is thank God, thanksgiving. So praise, thanksgiving. The third is petition or supplication. Ask the universe, ask God. But before you ask for blessings, praise and thank Him. Thank the source of all creation. And the last, before you leave that presence, say adorations. Recognize that the primacy of our relationship with the universe and why it was created for us. And I gave them by distribution to the people who came to the Association of Christian Birth Professionals. And so I had to pull scripture from both the New Testament and the Old Testament, the Psalms. I had my Tanakhs, I had all of my books stacked here, and I worked for weeks and weeks and weeks to pull the right scriptures. And I sought help for the New Testament, and I used BibleGateway.com, and it was wonderful. It was absolutely wonderful. And I remember that time sitting on my bed when I was called, and I opened the Bible and I heard that. And I tell this story often to audiences because, yes, it took me a while to get to that place on December 31st, 1980, when I said, I have to leave. I have to go forth. And I have to listen to God's voice and follow what it's telling me in everything that I do, whether those decisions are crazy, like getting on a plane and going to Russia when it was still the Soviet Union,
Yeah.
or sitting down and channeling half of the book that I wrote, Gentle Birth Choices. I would go into a hypnosis and I would see myself turning the pages and reading.
Mhm.
I would see myself writing it. And I checked myself into a Franciscan retreat house
Mhm.
that was silent. And I stayed there. I hired babysitters for my children, and my partner was there. And I stayed there for 10 days to finish the book. And I had stacks of books around me, and I had a brand new Macintosh SE computer. And I could put it in a box and take it with me. And the only time that you were allowed to speak in this place was during Vespers, where you would sing praises to God and thanksgiving to God, and you would read Psalms to each other. And as a Jew, I found so much comfort in being with the sisters and washing my own dishes and then going back to my room. And they would deliver a tray of food to my door for lunch. And then I would come down for dinner, and it was silent after the Vespers where we would be singing. And I knew that I had blossomed into something, but Olga, I had to fight every single day the demons that said, you're not good enough. Who are
Mm.
you to write this? Who are you to be the person to represent the unconscious spirit of this new person that could someday cure cancer, or this person that is in the womb? Who are you to tell us to focus on the prenatal psychology when
Mhm.
there's so many other people who are qualified to do that? Olga, my demons were there even yesterday.
Mm.
And that's why I have to have a ritual every single day to
Mm.
light a candle and say before I get out of bed, Motian I Lefaneka. Thank you, God, for returning my soul to me and letting me be in this body. Because if we don't practice it every single day, we can slip back into those stories that we created during the period of 20 weeks of gestation to the end of the 7th year, when we wrote our history of who we are. And that history was based on falsehoods. It was how we perceived the states of being of our mothers and our fathers, and their states of being were based on their histories. It goes back to the Song of Names. And whatever those histories were, that's what we epigenetically passed down. And yes, we have to rewrite and understand. And it takes what we call in Hebrew teshuvah, which is forgiveness. When we find forgiveness for ourselves and we connect with our own humanity, then we can see it in everyone. And we have greater understanding and a greater sense of doing God's holiness in this realm, because every single one of us on purpose is a broken vessel that is repaired with beautiful gold. And the more cracks we have, the more beautiful we shine.
What a beautiful way to conclude this interview, which could last another 2 hours without touching the same thing twice.
Mhm.
Thank you. Thank you for the sacredness you bring every day.
I was told that by the director of obstetrics at a hospital, one of the biggest hospitals in Tel Aviv. When I finished the seminar, he said, "You have not only given us the information on how to welcome babies into the world through water, but you have returned our souls to us. Thank you for helping us see clearly."
Thank you.